Well, thanks everybody for having me. I do appreciate it. This was scheduled for a little bit earlier. Sorry for not being able to make that time, but I had some family business to attend to. So super happy to talk to all of you. Hopefully we'll have a discussion that's a little bit theoretical and also pragmatic. As always, I'm open for any sort of discussion. Please feel free to ask questions throughout, whether that's in some sort of a chat message on the platform here, or you can email me or contact me on LinkedIn, or just feel free to ask the question straight away. So I do have a little presentation deck, and hopefully a little bit whimsical. Maybe I'll entertain you a bit, and hopefully something will stick with you as you're kind of going on your journey from a development of your business perspective and development if you're making products. I understand there's several of you that could be entrepreneurs, members of the community, or students looking to what to do next, what you'd like to progress, and so on. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and share some materials. It's kind of my stage props, if you will, and we can jump right in. Let's see here. Please tell me if my screen is correct as I do the share, because sometimes PowerPoint has its way with Zoom. We'll have to kind of fix that. Before I get started, are there any sort of questions, comments, any way we want to steer the discussion? And of course, this is going to be the wrong way. I'll go this way. Hopefully, is that correct now, Cecilia? Good. All right. If there's not any questions, I'll go ahead and move apace. The title of my talk here is I'm a Cynic. If you're not familiar with Simon Sinek, he does some great work. In particular, I'm going to talk about his golden circle for a moment, just at the outset of the materials. You should be too, right? His golden circle is really interesting. And the subtitle here is evidence-based product planning. As we'll kind of see in the arc of the discussion, a lot of organizations, while they may claim to do that, are actually quite stymied with getting that accomplished. And the results can be, fairly traumatic in terms of not seeing a product that is something, or a service or an offering that's something that your users or customers would like to buy. I do think that you can take many of these techniques and disciplines off to other domains. Maybe you're inside of an organization trying to reform a process or change an internal sort of business system. The same things can work and are certainly applicable there too. So with that in mind, first thing is, if you've not had the opportunity to watch Simon Sinek's TED Talk on the Golden Circle, it's really compelling. He talks about how leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Tim Cook, Steve Jobs, really what they do. And the so what behind his materials, his presentation, is the power of doing anything profound starts with understanding why. Why are you doing something? Then you progress. You go from why to what you need to do to how to execute it. And he talks about and shows through illustrations and a parable, the golden circle going from the position of why at the center of the circle that you see here, and playing with what and moving to how, and kind of some sort of balance between them. But the thing to understand is most teams immediately start with how. It's kind of backwards, right? So I'm going to do something, but I don't really know what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. And it's not quite as powerful. It doesn't enable you as a leader in whatever effort you're pursuing to basically bring people along with you and get the power of the whole team activated, right? So when we think about organizations that don't understand why, well, what does that look like? Where are we seeing some challenges in the product management discipline, which is where I spend pretty much I have spent the majority of my career in the information communications technology industry. Now, there's a great state of the product management kind of survey that's done on an annual basis by a company in the space called Product Plan. And there's a couple of extracts, a couple of charts from their report. And one of the things that many product managers find challenging is they can't build their work, their roadmaps, their efforts without understanding, or with understanding, customer requirements, market requirements, et cetera. That's one of the number one most sought after things, is to produce their roadmaps, their plans with the right amount of intelligence. And on the flip side of this, what they find is if they produce it, this is the chart on the right-hand side of the materials, if they have a good roadmap, if it's even evidence-based, the consumer, the number one consumer of that roadmap, are the executives inside the company. Almost the last consumer, if you can imagine, of their plan, of their output, are their customers, or their prospects, maybe their partners. It kind of seems backwards. In some sense, what they're saying is they'd love to spend more time building their plans, taking into account the whys, leading to the whats, and ultimately getting to the how, but they're spending an awful lot of time trying to convince their peers and their executives that it's the right thing to do. So there's a lot of effort wasted. Another interesting thing that you'll find if you have an opportunity, there's a link here to go take a look at the product plans materials, is internal politics are sort of the number one dreaded activity and time sink for many product managers. Same thing can be said for engineers or other groups that participate in sort of the product development process. Now, additionally, we work with other organizations, Silicon Valley Product Group in particular, that specializes in product management. And something that they've cited pretty interestingly is 95% of the companies that they work with in the product management and business development discipline tend to not spend enough time discovering why, not spend enough time understanding the intimacy or intimately understanding the customer requirements, the competitive landscape, the market requirements. All of that discovery work basically is left for later, or they make things up, right? Immediately jump to how. And so when you think about what happens when you don't understand why, you end up building things basically for your executive team. You're missing sort of the key information that produces the plans needed for your customer to want to buy whatever you're trying to sell them, whether, again, it's an internal audience or an actual external product. Some key signs that you're maybe not understanding why are codified in some of these questions. So if you're not able to answer these questions with authority, clarity, and sort of with evidence, you probably have not been able to answer why. And that's super important. First one here is, what are your competitors doing, or who are your competitors in the space? I have a former colleague who works in France. He is participating in the venture capital circle there in France and in the European Union. And what he remarks on is there are many young companies who come, pitch their ideas as he tries to do the technical due diligence, but they don't really understand if they're competing with anybody in the market. Has someone else already invented their idea? Is there a weakness, something that they can exploit? The customer dissatisfied for their competition? The general response is, we're engineers, we'll just build it. Again, kind of making things up, immediately running to how, not understanding why. On the flip side, I have, again, another colleague that works at a small venture company called Chaos Search. Throughout his career, as I've talked to him about the product management space, what he has suggested is there are a lot of people that make things up. In fact, this quote sort of sums up his sentiment. He's run into people who he convinced were making things up. He almost fired the individual for the purposes of not being able to clearly articulate why they were building things. Why did they have engineering off doing some work that would or would not benefit their customers? None of it could be articulated. So he caught him basically making things up, leading to wasteful efforts. We'll talk in a moment about what waste looks like at a macroeconomic context. A frequent question that you hear as well from leadership, from engineers, is, are we building this effort for one customer, one user? Or are we doing it for a broad cross-section of our users, of our customers, of our partners, or our internal audiences? And not only that, which customers can you point to me? Can you provide me that breadcrumb trail of customers that have asked for this thing that you're requesting the engineering team spend time on? Once that's done, large companies like Google are wondering how they can defend their work efforts. Can they defend their roadmaps? Can they go to the board as required, show that they're responding to the competition, meeting the needs of their partners, of their customers? Is that a feasible thing to do? Well, if I'm presenting to my executives, if I'm not understanding why, if I'm not spending time with my users, that's not an easy question to answer. And then, interestingly, if you've not done any of the work to build for your customers, to build for your users, to respond to the competitive landscape, what you hear are reflections from your sales force, such as there on the bottom. Does the executive environment really understand and care about our customers? So those are questions that, if you're being asked them, may mean you've not been able to clearly articulate why. Just pointing back for a minute, why is kind of the sense and source of power for doing anything in the product management and product development space. So what can this mean, at least from a macroeconomic perspective? So sourced here, there's effectively what you'll find between the United States, European Union, and China. There's about $1.7 trillion spent annually on research and development. I'm sure you'll hear about rules of thumb, such as 8 out of 10 R&D activities tend to fail. Something else that you'll find is 85% of the output of this R&D is not profitable. And a key reason for the lack of profitability is not understanding what the user wants to buy. That points back again to not talking to them, to not understanding why they need to solve a problem, and therefore what problem it is that they're attempting to solve. Personally, I've seen projects where we, at my previous workplace of Hitachi, spent an awful lot of time clearly understanding what our customers needed, clearly documenting those, working deeply with engineering. And what that resulted in many instances are businesses that grew very quickly from single order tens of millions of dollars up to hundreds of millions of dollars, $500 million. In 2 years, another project went from zero to about $250 million, again, because we paid attention to what our customers wanted to buy. Now, while that's not the only factor, it is certainly a key contributing factor to building the right thing for your users to consume. Right? So before I get into how you might want to solve a problem, how to find out why, what are some practical things you can do and structure your thinking? Are there any questions that might be from the audience? Or answers? I like answers too. That's always fun. I don't bite. So any question's a good question. Okay, so look, doing something that clearly articulates why you need to build or not build a feature, a product, an offer, it's not that hard. It's not that complicated to understand. Actually executing it is quite a challenge. In my career, what we started doing largely by accident, because we had an engineering team that was in Japan, they had English as a second language, and needed to be convinced that their investments were the right investments for the market. What we did is, as a group, as a technical product manager, sometimes you'll hear product owner today, we went together with engineering out into the market. We went and talked to customers. Together, we understood what the competition was doing. We went on the road. I was personally with people that drove from downtown New York, so basically Midtown, to Weehawken, New Jersey, in the back of a car in the middle of winter, all packed in together. And what that did is that developed a kind of intimacy between the product management and engineering organization. As we traveled together, we debated what we heard from our customers. We worked through our conflicts. We built a safe space to basically engage and determine what the right things to do were. And that created a lot of mutual respect. And all of us understood that we were approaching solving problems for our customers with an abiding interest in their needs and keeping them first. What we produced from a documentation perspective is really a part of the story here. We produced raw intelligence. So we literally, before it was a thing, we recorded all of our user interviews. This was way back in roughly 2005 and 2006. We then constructed out of that key themes, and I'll kind of show you a structure for that. We produced the story of the product, user narratives, and then made early prototypes. And so we sort of had this traceability. We had the ability to say and listen to what the customers asked for. We could relate to what many of them wanted. That produced themes, and these themes we could turn into a story. What we need the product to do. How would the user interface with it? And that story lasted over many years in some cases and produced many sets of requirements. And it was also something we could refine. Maybe the most important thing, though, was we had a mutual understanding and we understood a shared sense of priority, and it was backed and defensible by strong documentation. So the four things, again, are pretty simple to do. Product management and engineering intimacy. We built with these series of collateral, a growing body of knowledge, right? It's almost like a bank where you put it away and you can tap into it later. It was all transparent, whether it was an executive, whether it was the board, whether it was an individual engineering. Everyone could understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, who we were doing it for. And then the engineering team got to the most efficient way to execute the how part. And then finally, what we did is we didn't throw any of this away. We kept interviews, we banked them for the future. We kept the interactions with other companies, competitive insights, et cetera, as methodologies, as tooling to enable future decisioning, right? Because what we find is these efforts can be expensive from a time perspective. It's quite an effort to basically, again, go execute some of these things. So what did that look like? What are the processes we tend to take when it comes to trying to build this evidence? It first starts with a kind of brainstorming session. I use called the affinity method. I'm sure you can bring your own to the table. But in effect, the affinity method, as you see here, this is one such execution I was doing in the Boston area, where you bring together sets of people, maybe groups of 5 to 7 people, and sort of think about some key questions, come up with some core kernel ideas. And the intention is to take those quality ideas and distill them into some pitch materials, rough prototypes, and other sorts of things where you can share them with customers, a questionnaire, all the things you'd want to know about the space to prove or disprove some of your hypotheses. The next step is really to schedule your interviews. Actually, the first 2 steps, while it takes some time, are fairly easy to do. Getting your interviews scheduled, confirmed, and the ability to show up and actually conduct the interview on the day you're supposed to is quite a big challenge. I've certainly run into some interesting types of problems. Some of them are quite morbid. I had an interview cancel on me, come to find out that the principal we were expecting to interview in Asia Pacific, Japan, had died on holiday. So real things happen to real people, some of them quite extreme. In other cases, things just canceled because there's an operational event that occurs and you can't get to the expert you need to talk to. So the scheduling process, one of the more difficult things that you need to basically work through, it's something that I have worked on in my career for quite a long time. It requires trust granted to you from your customers, your sellers, or your target users who might be interested or not interested in talking to you, and their commitment and time. After you've done all of your interviews, after you show up, after you've made your recordings, it's really important to memorialize them. Whether you have recordings, transcriptions, summary notes, competitive white papers, competitive briefs, this is not a step to be skipped. It's vitally important because what it does, especially in today's age where maybe we don't have the proof required to make an investment choice, this data actually becomes compelling and clear that we need to execute a certain outcome. We need to build a certain thing, and we have done our homework. We understand what we're building and why we're doing it. And therefore, when we go make the expensive investment to build it, market it, and sell it, it's well justified. For a bit of rule of thumb kind of thinking about what this means is, by the way, 60% of the cost of any program occurs outside of engineering and product management. And so if we let things escape that aren't sellable, or they're too far ahead of the market and the sales team's not ready, then what happens is we never get the return on our investment. So many things basically become doomed if we've not done our early work, because it's quite expensive after the release to basically enable the program and not just the product or the offering. So since I mentioned before, this is expensive, I usually see it take between 3 to 6 months, closer to 3 if you have a very trusting selling organization, if your customers are accepting of this behavior, longer if you need to build that relationship with your selling organization. As I mentioned before, this is an expensive process. And so what we want to be able to do is amortize the time spent here over multiple cycles. So when I go do design for a new feature, when I go do design for even for a new product or a new offer, I want to be able to look back on kind of a bank, a data bank of these interviews, of these interactions with various companies, and redraw new insights from them. look back and see if we saw trends earlier because we have new information based on what's going on in the market, be able to justify our future activities. And so what you also see here is a kind of cycle where I may do multiple iterations of these interviews. I may have some initial ideas, maybe it's 5, I'm able to win them down to 2. I want to deepen those 2, and I'll go back to some of the same customers or users, or evaluate competitors in a different way, or go to new ones and test some new ideas or deepen the testing of particular ideas. And so it becomes an iterative process. Of course, that means you need to refine your materials, refine your ideas, refine your schedule, find new teams to basically go talk to. Bit of a perspective here. I had a team that I managed at Hitachi. We did about 25 or 30 interviews per year, usually 2 to 3 topics. That produced a lot of interesting outcomes that we use on a regular basis to prove that our investments were needed without the expense of a lot of traveling, a lot of interactions out in the field, and time spent with customers before we went to make the investment of that effort. Any comments or questions so far? So coming out of this, you produced your high quality ideas. You've talked to your users, you've evaluated the competitive fields, you look generally at the market. How do you get a sense of what to do first? I have built and work with teams that have built a kind of table such as this, where you list up a theme, sort of a title synthesized from the description of it. You sort of soak in all the information, you reread the interview outcomes, maybe some of the transcripts, re-listen to audio recordings, maybe you've got Zoom meetings that you've recorded. You understand what those themes are. You get a sense of the frequency, however you define that, number of discrete customers that have repeated a particular theme, or maybe number of occurrences in the overall body of collateral itself. Gives you a sense to judge priority itself. You then produce a list of companies, right? So we're trying to answer some of those questions cited earlier on in the discussion. So which companies actually asked for this? Which competitors, or which types of companies, be they partners, competitors, and users? Do we see consistent need? Do we see kind of divergence of need? And then trying to distill these down into maybe some forceful quotes from some customers, from some competitors, et cetera, to kind of announce what that theme is. What we do then to kind of create a further statement in, I guess, relating this from the why part, which is really what this seeks to answer, to the what part, is we take the description and we further break it down into requirements. Sometimes if you're working in tools like AHA, which is a typical product management tool today, or JIRA, something that engineering tends to use, you'll find the requirements may be called epics and features and stories. I also like to see a narrative form written of the story of the product. What is that surface between the product, the offer, the solution, and the customer, the user? What are they attempting to do? How does the system respond? Those tend to be kind of larger and, little e epic when it comes to what you're attempting to accomplish, and may span over multiple releases. So again, that notion of building collateral that lasts and tells the story of a product over time. Companies understanding who, whether they're customers, whether they're users, potential customers, partners, competitors, et cetera, maybe answer many of the defensible or make defensible many of the tricky questions that you could be asked by executives, by engineers. Did a customer ask for this? How many customers asked for this? Do you understand who the competition is? What are they doing in the space? So by doing this kind of homework, by doing it religiously, what you'll be able to do is answer some of these key questions. Whether your stakeholder's a venture capital investor, there's somebody at a bank, whether it's your executive leader at a company. Right? This sort of format helps you kind of structure your thinking in a way that answers many of those questions that are tricky and hard to deal with. It helps you distill the why. I heard somebody came off mute. Was there a question? All right. So what I mean by defensibility is sort of something that looks like this. This is reminiscent of what's called the Sankey chart. It's a way to kind of look at strengths of particular nodes as they flow through from left to right. And it's really another way of thinking about and looking at how many companies or discrete entities aligned to a particular theme, how a story is related to or description is related to a particular theme, and then how that gets further broken down into requirements. So whether you're going from the company to the requirement, or the series of companies to the requirement, or from the requirements back to the individual companies, you have backwards and forwards traceability. Things are transparent. There's relationships that are established. You're able with confidence to go to further steps. That means doing revenue forecasting, assumption-based financial modeling, justifying and negotiating with engineering or other teams internally to build what needs to be built. Building your development plan or your business plan, basically, for what you plan to construct as a company. In this example, hopefully starts to make sense that the first theme is the most important. The second theme is of second importance, and theme N is maybe of least importance. And so that will give you a sense of what to do first, what to do second, what to do third. And those are crucial discussions because sometimes you'll end up with engineers that are highly skeptical. Here's a good example of that. In Hitachi, we needed to drastically improve the user experience for our management of our information communication technology systems. And the engineering team did not want to do that. So because we understood that this was one of the biggest problems for our customers, how to activate our systems, how to manage them, how to get the most out of them on a day in and day out basis, how to defend their purchases of millions of dollars, we knew that that usability was of the utmost importance. So what we did, because we understood this by going through this process, is our negotiation started with, you need to do this, and ended with, we will take all other requirements off the table and have you just focus on the usability. At that point, the engineering team understood we were serious, and it was a key part of the development of our business. And without some of the work done to improve the usability, we would not see increased adoption of the products, which would help everybody be successful financially, help our customers be successful by defending their investments in Hitachi. So this is a very well understood process, at least by me and many others in the industry, and certainly something that enables that kind of defensibility and transparency for all constituents involved. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is managing and banking these sorts of things for the future. What you see here, because I'm like many of you who maybe are developing a new business or are an entrepreneur thinking about developing a new business, or maybe you're a student who's kind of imagining what you'd like to do next. This is an example of us working with a customer who is effectively got many transcripts that have come in and trying to help them do a better job at picking some of those key themes. So again, we've got the sense of these interviews, we have these audio recordings, and we're helping them produce the appropriate documentation so that they have the right level of defensibility. This is a venture company to produce for their board and their investors. Since I early on said that this process can be quite expensive, it's important to make sure that these data are prepared for reuse at a future point in time. Maybe you heard something new. In a new type of interaction, you need to go back and see if that was present before, and therefore you have additional evidence, missed something, etc. And so this is just an example of a structure and format I've used in terms of the file name to enable that kind of banking and forward and backwards traceability. So you can see here, I've got customer names and locations and other sorts of things, because there's additional questions you can start to ask yourself if you understand this, such as, are you getting the right sampling of input from the entire territory that you do business in? So again, you want to bank these things for your future. These sort of interactions with partners, with customers, synthesis of competition, this is your core IP. This tells you why. This gives you the power to activate and build your plans. Now we've got a question here, which is, can we automate some of this? Certainly that's my intent, my journey from an entrepreneurial perspective, is I'm on many of the same, or I'm maybe the journey with many of the same of you all, is to try and take some of the ideas that I've used, some of the structure that I've used in my career, and turn that into something that makes it easier for people to come behind me and do the same thing. I want that 95% of companies that maybe don't do the right thing, or organizations that don't do the right thing, to become a smaller number, so that everybody's kind of building for their users and passionate about what they want to sell in the market. So covered pretty much everything I wanted to in 30 minutes. Hopefully crisp and short. I am happy to have a deep discussion on anything. I have examples and samples that I can share over time. Always open for additional dialogue and discussion. Maybe somebody has some answers or would like to talk through some of the things they're doing if they're willing to share.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone, if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly. These slides and the presentation recording will be distributed and posted on our website. But if you do have any questions, while we still have Michael online, feel free to ask them now.
So I do want to, there is a question about the pandemic, and I'll just go ahead and read it. It's in the Zoom chat. The pandemic challenged many individuals to adapt and learn to use tools such as Zoom and online surveys. Do you think this potentially helped lower the time frame and made the outreach process more accessible? I think it's a bit of both. So absolutely, tools like Zoom, tools like Teams, WebEx, all of those online tools do a lot of things that are super helpful. Like they're just like we're recording this session, recordings become ubiquitous. You also get in some of these tools straight up transcription, which when I started, basically this was the transcription. So that work is done. Some of the heavy lifting is taken off the table. It's cheaper to actually go spend time with the target user. Maybe use a platform like LinkedIn, maybe Twitter. I've certainly used both to reach out to my target audiences to try and get some one-on-one time with them. And because a 30-minute, a 45-minute, a 1-hour conversation is inexpensive, from a time perspective, yes, it's lowered the barrier to entry. Additionally, there are services like GuidePoint that specialize in this very thing, where they bring together people who want to understand a problem and people who maybe are experts in that problem space, and they put them together and enable a kind of dialogue. The one thing that it has done, so it comes at some sacrifice, is the relationship between engineering and the product team, where there should be no daylight, is challenged. So it becomes hard to go spend time on the road with your engineering cohort or cohorts and build that partnership such that when the engineering leadership or the engineering architect goes back to the engineering team, they are making decisions, small decisions based upon the voice of the customer, the voice of the user, the sense of the market. That's what's sacrificed. So it's extra hard to kind of build that partnership within the local team, but super easy, as you point out, and lowers the barrier to entry to kind of go engage with your target audience. So the answer to the question on how early, the next question is, how early is too early to conduct interviews? Is a proof of concept too early? Heck no. I would even go before there's a proof of concept. You might even just have some ideas to test. In many cases, when I went to go test just the ideas, that was of great value. You can always come back and bring a prototype to the next discussion. A part of this is continuing a dialogue. In fact, if you're very early, a part of these early interviews helps you identify potentially target consumers, early first users, helps you critically and clearly understand what you don't need to focus on, what you can focus on, all of the important details that help you make the right choices earlier in the cycle. And again, it's more expensive after you release something, especially if you're in a larger organization or you're building an organization where you have to construct the go-to-market artifice, the sellers, the marketing, the support, the maintenance, all of those things. That's where the majority of the expense lies. So it's cheaper to start sooner. It's important to do that early discovery work much, much, much sooner. And I would articulate even before the prototypes are done, you could test some of the ideas.
Any more questions for Michael? Feel free to type them in the chat or just unmute yourself before we get off. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions,
there's one more that popped up.
Oh, it says thank you.
Happy to share the presentation. As always, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter at MIHey42. Same thing. on LinkedIn. You can find me, send me a message. I can share some of the things I'm doing, some of the experiences I've had in a little bit more detail, format structures, those sorts of things. I'm super happy to help. I do think, and one of the problems I'd love to work on with all of you is, at least from an engineering and business perspective, I don't think it's early enough. It's never early enough to start the relationship between the engineering and the product teams. Like the engineering teams at UNM should be asking their business people from the Anderson School of Management why they're doing things. Did users actually make the request for that? And vice versa, is challenging engineering teams on the most efficient way and elegant way and best way on how to get something accomplished, whatever that is. So I'm super open to have a dialogue anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your time and for this super valuable information. I think we all really appreciated it. And thank you everyone for attending. We have 2 more webinars this week, actually. So tomorrow we have one on, it's kind of similar to this one, but the next steps on when you're starting a startup, what are the steps you need to do? And then on Thursday, we have one on sales tips for small business, and you can find those on our website. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you later. Thank you, Michael.